staff, thanks to the entire staff at the Beit Agnon Literary Festival. I'll just briefly introduce the book that we'll be discussing this evening, and then we will have a couple of hours with Matti Friedman. I'm getting a note from the producer. We have only 1 hour. I'm sorry, Matti. We'll make it. We'll make the pace fast. Just to set the scene a little bit. The Leonard Cohen to whom Matti introduces us in his latest book, Who by Fire, has not yet become the idolized figure of the wise prophet or the great lyricist whose musical language could reach the soul. He is instead almost 40 years old. He's an artist who's at midlife. He feels stuck, stalled at a creative dead end. He's already somewhat famous for songs like Suzanne, Bird on the Wire, So Long Marianne. But the way Matti depicts him at the opening of the book, he's also quite gloomy and restless and, among other things, struggling to accept his new role as a father. On hearing reports of the outbreak of the Yom Kippur War in October 1973, Leonard Cohen writes, "I wanted to go fight and die." When he did follow the summons and got on the next flight to Tel Aviv, he took nothing with him, not even a guitar. In this latest book, Who by Fire, Matti tells the almost parable-like tale of a poet and a singer who somehow rediscovers his purpose in the Sinai desert. But as viewed through Matti's very textured repertorial lens, Cohen's journey also becomes part of this much broader saga of a 25-year-old country facing a turning point as it struggles for its very survival. The book, as Matti writes, examines the meeting of young soldiers at a moment of extreme peril with one of the great voices of the age. So welcome, Matti, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Stephen, for doing it.
I wanted to lead off with asking you about how you came to the story. Some writers feel, I don't choose the stories choose me. Did you feel something like that with this book?
Well, I'm Canadian. I was born and raised in Toronto, moved to Israel when I was 17, and I guess I have a weakness for Canadian Israeli stories, and there aren't that many. In fact, I'm not sure there's another one worth telling other than this one. So I guess in that way, this story was kind of, screaming at me, please, who else is going to care about this if you don't? I remember that Cohen showed up in Israel in 2009 for this, what turned out to be an incredible concert in Ramat Gan. And he was a man in his 70s, and he'd gone back on the road for this resurrection tour after having been out of the public eye for many years, and discovered that he could fill stadiums around the world. And the last concert in that tour, that first round of the resurrection tour, was in Tel Aviv. And I just remembered noticing that Israelis went crazy for Leonard Cohen. And I just couldn't understand exactly what was going on, because for me, he's a Canadian icon. And of course, I grew up with him and with his music. And I had no idea that Israelis loved him so much. And I couldn't quite understand why, for example, when the tickets went on sale, the phone lines crashed. Or why 50,000 people came to see him outside Tel Aviv. And then I saw an article in one of the papers that told the story of this war tour. And it was clear to me that that was part of the explanation, that something had happened between these people years earlier. And it wasn't exactly clear what it was and what had happened and what he was doing here, but something electric had happened on the Sinai front of the Yom Kippur War in 1973. And it was in 2009 that the story kind of grabbed me, and it took many, many years to write. The book came out this year, so you can do the math. It was a slow project that took a long time to ripen, but it started there.
In your previous book, Pumpkin Flowers, in 2016, you describe your experience serving in the IDF in South Lebanon. Do you think that also played a role? I mean, in a way that you drew on those experiences in writing this particular story?
I think so. I'm not sure that I was aware of it at the beginning, but as I wrote this story and realized that it couldn't just be a story about a concert tour, it had to be a story about a war. And as I dove deeper into the stories of the soldiers, I realized that yes, I was kind of back in familiar ground in a way that surprised me. I had kind of expected to be going back to something I knew about Canada, a great Canadian artist, and I hadn't quite understood, I think, that what I was writing about was a Canadian who'd been dropped into a Middle Eastern catastrophe. And though I, of course, am not Leonard Cohen, and my little war in South Lebanon in the late 90s was not the Yom Kippur War, there's enough in those experiences that made it, I think, possible for me to grasp what was going on there on both sides. A bit of what Leonard Cohen must have felt just, appearing on the Sinai front without knowing where he was, without speaking any Hebrew, without understanding the complicated politics and the complicated culture of the place. And at the same time, I could, feel the excitement and the confusion and the terror, I think, of the soldiers who were caught at that moment. And I remember in a first draft of the book, I was trying to describe the concerts in Sinai, these incredible concerts, which were by all accounts unforgettable. And I wrote about the soldiers that, they heard this music knowing that it might be the last thing they ever heard. And then someone very smart who read the book said, listen, this is a book about Leonard Cohen. What you should say is that he played the music for them, knowing that it could be the last thing they ever heard. But I was with the soldiers. It really made clear to me that when I imagined myself at one of those concerts, I wasn't on stage. I'm not Leonard Cohen. I was one of the guys in green who happened to see him. So yes, there's a lot of my own experiences in this book for sure.
Yeah, you remind me of a beautiful passage in the book where you describe speaking to former soldiers from that campaign who, despite not understanding the English lyrics, the poetry itself, they told you that they remember feeling that Cohen's music somehow spoke to their hearts. And I'll just read one small quote about how you describe how Cohen's music moved them on an emotional level. You say, the melody served the function ascribed to music by the Hasidic masters, that is, to make feeling and meaning available to those unable or unwilling to understand the words, or even to suggest feelings and meanings for which words fall short. Can you think of a particular soldier that you interviewed who made you think along those lines? Someone who may not have understood the words, but fell into the wordlessness of it all?
Yes, there was one pilot who I interviewed. I mean, I call them, I still think of them as pilots and soldiers, although they're all guys in their 70s now. But one of the pilots, whose name was Amos, remembered coming into this base, the movie theater of an Air Force base. And this was the worst moment in the history of the Israeli Air Force, which was being decimated by these new missiles that the Soviets had given the Arab armies. And the Air Force had been, riding high after the 6-Day War, which they basically won in a matter of hours. And everyone expected that to happen again. And instead, the Air Force was shredded, and people were taking off from these bases and just disappearing and never coming back. And amid all of this, Leonard Cohen appeared at an Air Force base. And I remember speaking to one of these pilots. He was a kid, at the time, and he said he walked into the theater in his dirty, flight coveralls, and there was no room. The theater was already full, and Cohen was already on stage, so he sat down in between the first row and the stage, and he just looked up at Cohen, who was lit up, and he remembered Cohen looking down at him, and he sensed that there was some connection between them, and he said, I didn't understand all the words, but something about it touched us. There was something about Leonard Cohen that convinced people that he understood them. He had that quality, and he particularly gave that impression to people who were on the edge and who sensed that Leonard Cohen knew what that was all about. And maybe the best example of that is a series of events that happens not long before the Yom Kippur War, where Leonard Cohen goes to play in mental hospitals in the UK. And he takes his band and he insists on playing for patients at mental hospitals. And a very powerful connection happens between Cohen and the people in the audience, which is strange. But I think that Cohen had this empathetic quality that really worked. He was really a master on stage, and he's so disheveled sometimes and so self-effacing that you don't notice that he's actually a master of personal connection. And he really worked that magic in Sinai. And the soldiers who saw him there never forgot it. It ended up being, in a strange way, one of the pivotal memories for many people of the Yom Kippur War, even though it's not even a memory of the war. It has no strategic importance. It didn't change anything. And yet the presence of Leonard Cohen seems to have really touched people, and Israelis really never forgot it.
I want to ask you about at least one time where the magic failed, spectacularly so, in a very comic way. You describe a wonderful scene because you mentioned that 1973 was not Cohen's first visit here. It was preceded by a kind of a fiasco in 1972. I hope Tal, who's on the technical end, can queue up a very short 30-second video from that 1972 performance. Let's see if that works.
It says in the Kabbalah that unless Adam and Eve face each other, God does not sit on his throne. And somehow the male and female part of me refuse to encounter one another tonight. And God does not sit on his throne. And this is a terrible thing to happen in Jerusalem. So listen, we're going to leave the stage now and try to profoundly meditate in the dressing room to get ourselves back into shape. And if we can manage, we will be back. I'd like to give the people their money back. I really would. It's not there. So I can't.
Okay, we can cue it there. Thank you. What happened? Why did he walk off mid-show? What was it about performing in Jerusalem that seemed to unnerve him?
I just love that clip. It happens the year before the Yom Kippur War, and if you continue watching, you'll see him say something very interesting, which is that this only happened to him once before, he tells someone around him, and it was when he played in Montreal for an audience that included his family. So there was something about the audience in Israel that threw him, because he couldn't treat it just like another gig. It wasn't just an auditorium full of people. It was, in some weird way, family. And that's what he means, I think, when he says, this is a terrible thing to happen in Jerusalem. There's something going on with the crowd in Jerusalem. And by the way, an even more amazing thing happens a minute or two later, when the crowd in Jerusalem doesn't do what you'd expect them to do, which is, get really pissed off and storm out of the auditorium or have a riot or something. What they do, Cohen leaves the stage, the band leaves the stage, and the audience starts singing, Hevenu Shalom Alechem, Hevenu Shalom, which is a song that every Jewish kid knows in Israel or in the diaspora. And I think they just thought he would know it because he was family, right? He must know that song. And he did know it. And he hears it in the dressing room, and eventually he comes back out on stage, and you can see this in the documentary film. He's standing on the stage, and he's just kind of smiling at them. He can't believe it. It's a few thousand Israelis singing to him. And he gets his mojo back, picks up the guitar, and gives an amazing concert that ends with everyone in tears. The audience, Cohen, the band, they leave the stage in tears. So there's something very powerful going on here, and it's something that can be paralyzing, but it's also something that brings the concerts up to a level that I think he doesn't find in most other places. And in Sinai, this was ramped up further by the quality of the concerts. So, we haven't talked we haven't exactly explained how Cohen got to the Sinai front, and we can if you want, but just to describe what the concerts look like, and in a moment I can show a few photos just to illustrate it. Cohen isn't playing stadiums, right? It's not Bob Hope. Sometimes people imagine that it's like a Bob Hope situation, or like that scene in Apocalypse Now where the Playboy bunnies land on helicopters. It wasn't like that at all. It was completely disorganized. It was basically Cohen and a few other musicians who joined him in a Jeep driving around the desert and stopping when they saw soldiers. And they would see a few artillery pieces parked in the sand, and they would stop the vehicle, and they would get out and ask the soldiers if they wanted to hear any music. And just to give you a sense of the scene in Sinai in those days, this is a picture of the forces moving up to the Suez Canal before the Israeli army crosses the Suez Canal in the great counterattack that changes the course of the war. And Cohen's moving in the desert around these events. And just an interesting or awful detail about this photograph, which was taken by a soldier named Isaac Shokal, who appears in the book. The soldier you see in the foreground of the photograph with the cigarette in his mouth, That's an officer named Yoshua Katz, who was killed a few hours after the photograph was taken. Now let's see the next photo. This is just another photo taken from in that same unit of soldiers by Isaac Shokal. Just a fabulous photograph that gives you a taste of what that moment felt like in Sinai. Let's see the next one. So when the Israeli army goes to war, as many of you probably know, Israeli singers follow the army to war, and that happened in the Yom Kippur War as well. So all the famous artists in Israel were at the front playing for troops, and you had, Kaveret, which was a huge act at the time, and all the biggest acts in the country were there. So here we have a singer. The singer's unidentified, unfortunately, in this archival photograph, but you get a sense of what the concerts looked like. There were no seats. There was usually no amp. In this case, you can see there's a mic. In most of Cohen's concerts, according to the testimonies we have, he just stood on ammunition crates and played Suzanne with his acoustic guitar with no amp, and just using the Jeep headlights as spotlights. So this is what it looked like. It was completely rough, completely raw. No one was selling tickets. No one was selling records. No money was changing hands at all, and everyone was sober. So it was not, it wasn't the usual concert scene. It was something that was much more elevated, and you can see it in the photograph. Something big was happening at these concerts. Music was a matter of life and death at these concerts, and I think that's an important part of why this is such an important experience for Cohen. Let's see the next photograph, Tal. So here we have a picture of the man himself at a concert that happened on the far side of the Suez Canal. So one thing that I learned while writing this book, which is quite incredible if you think about it, was that Leonard Cohen crossed the Suez Canal a day or two behind the Israeli army. So when the territory was hardly under Israeli control and when it was still quite dangerous. So there was no one keeping track of the artists exactly. There was no one running the concerts. They were just following the army and showing up. And you see that happening here. This is near a base called Faid on the Egyptian side of the Suez Canal, near the headquarters of Ariel Sharon. And you can see what it was like. Here we have a technician from Army Radio recording Cohen. Unfortunately, the recordings seem to have been lost. But you also see that Cohen is in an elevated state. He seems transported. Some of the soldiers also seem very interested in him. Not everyone. You see the guy smoking in the background, right? The soldiers had a lot going on. Not everyone knew who Leonard Cohen was. But in some of the photographs, I think, if I remember correctly, what the next one is. So let's see the next one, Tom. Right. So here you see that something's going on. Right. This is Cohen in a different mental state. He's also wearing something that looks a lot like a uniform, which was part of what was going on in those weeks. Cohen kind of goes native, and he sleeps on the ground with the soldiers, and he eats combat rations, and he asks people to call him Eliezer Cohen, which is his Hebrew name, because Leonard is a hard name for Israelis to say, and it sounds very foreign. And to this day, Israelis can't really pronounce it. People call him Leonard Cohen. But Eliezer Cohen is a very standard Israeli name. It's kind of like Joe Smith for Israelis. So he goes native, and here he almost looks like one of the soldiers. By the way, to Cohen's left, on our right, in the yellow T-shirt, is a face that many of you probably recognize. That's Matti Kaspi, who's considered in Israel to be a musical genius on the level of Cohen, more or less. At the time, he was just 23 years old. He was just starting out, and he was one of the Israeli musicians who ends up accompanying Cohen on this improvised tour of the desert. Do we have more photos? I can't remember, Tao. Okay, here's one of the most famous photos of the tour. I guess the most famous photo of the tour, taken by a soldier. All these photos are taken by soldiers who happen to be there. There's no official record of this tour. There's no video. So a soldier named Yaakov Doron, who was an artillery officer, happened to pass by when Cohen was singing. And in my opinion, this is one of the greatest Jewish photographs of the 20th century, because you have these incredible archetypes in the photograph. Of course, in the center of the photograph, you have Leonard Cohen, one of the great diaspora characters of the 20th century, a poet, a man of peace, whose Judaism was universal and very wrapped up in his idea of art. And then on Cohen's right, on our left, we have Ariel Sharon, right? General Arik Sharon, one of the great warriors that Israel has produced. And in many ways, Cohen's just polar opposite. And here they are together. and together in the middle of the Yom Kippur War. These are almost two different Jewish futures that meet. And I guess it's worth pointing out that, well, actually, do we have more talent? Do we have more photos, or is that the last one? That's the last one, I think. Funny thing about that is that Leonard Cohen mentions Ariel Sharon in this manuscript that he writes about the Yom Kippur War. And what he says is, they took me, we're driving through the desert, they take me to see, I'm paraphrasing, but it's more or less this, the lion of the desert. That's what he calls Ariel Sharon, whose name means Lion of God. That's what Ariel means. And Cohen says, I want your job. He kind of, which is not what you expect Leonard Cohen to say if you think of him as kind of an artist and a man of peace, but there's something about military force that he admires. And at the same time, he says, how dare you? Like, how dare you, I guess, send men into battle and decide life and death. But he's just awed by Sharon, and he mentions him in his manuscript. And I always wondered whether Ariel Sharon had anything to say about Cohen. And I read Sharon's memoir, the part about the war, no mention of Cohen. I called Sharon's son, Gilad Sharon, and asked him if he'd ever heard his father mention Leonard Cohen. And he said no. So Leonard Cohen seems to have made very little impression on Ariel Sharon, but Sharon made a big impression on Cohen, and I still think it's just an incredible image from that incredible tour.
You write that there's only one description of any of these concerts to appear in print at the time, and that's a piece in Rolling Stone magazine. And I think you mentioned in that article that the Rolling Stone reporter describes Cohen as, quote, the great pacifist. Why was that the perception at the time?
The magazine was an Israeli equivalent of Rolling Stone, so it didn't quite make it into Rolling Stone. I don't think anyone in the music press in the States knew where Cohen was or what he was up to. So this was a magazine called Lahiton. If there are any Israelis of, I guess 60 and up in the audience, they might remember Lahiton. So they had a music reporter, it was a magazine about music culture, very 60s, very kind of counterculture oriented. And and the reporter identifies Cohen. He almost mocks him in the article. He doesn't like it that Cohen's here. Kind of a war tourist, this guy who's calls him a pacifist. What is he doing here in our war? And by the end of the concert, you can tell that the reporter has kind of been won over because Cohen, he seems authentic. Something about Cohen's tour worked, and I think it wouldn't have worked had he been accompanied by groupies or roadies or by a film crew. And if there'd been any hint of exploitation in it, it wouldn't have worked. But Cohen was there on his own. It was clearly coming from a very authentic spot in his soul. The fact that he was here and he was here, right? No one had to come. Most Jewish artists didn't show up to support Israeli troops in the Yom Kippur War. And it meant something. So even that skeptical reporter, by the end of the article, you can kind of see that he's come over to Cohen's side.
You've already mentioned the term resurrection. You also write that Cohen really saw death on the battlefields in the Sinai. He saw dying soldiers being stretchered off helicopters. And you quote this almost devastating line in his journal from the time where he says, "This is a place where you may begin again." And I think you draw the obvious connection with the revelation at Sinai, right? That this is the place of all places. And in the end, he chose life. In your depiction, at least, he chose to give himself a second lease on his creative life. I'm wondering if you could say something about how that choice that was made at exactly this turning point affected his subsequent trajectory as a songwriter.
I guess we should say that before the Yom Kippur War, and you mentioned it briefly at the beginning, Leonard Cohen was done. He thought he was finished with everything. He announced that he was retiring from music. He felt like he had nothing left to say. He was sick of the music business. He was despondent about his personal life. He was on this Greek island in a very difficult relationship, as far as he was concerned, with a woman named Suzanne, with whom he had a very long and serious relationship, and they had a child. And he felt that everything was going badly, and he basically informed his fans that was it for Leonard Cohen. And he was 39 years old, so it makes sense. How many rock stars make it to 39 or past 39? So that's where the war catches Cohen. And if we look back at Cohen's Jewish life, we'll see something interesting, which is he has this idea that Jewish life in the 20th century, he thinks the kind of Jewish life he experienced in Montreal, in Westmount, in kind of an upscale part of Montreal, he felt like it was dead, basically, that the Jews had forgotten what they were supposed to be doing, which is receiving divine transmissions and translating them into the language of humans. And that, we were all just sociologists, basically, he says that explicitly, and we were just kind of knocking on our own doors, he says. We're just knocking on our own doors, and we're surprised that no one's answering. And he gives this incredible speech to the community in Montreal in 1964 as he kind of leaves the community permanently and explains to them why he's doing it. He says, once 4,000 years ago, he said, we had a vertical seizure. And he's talking about Sinai. The Jewish people had this ability to communicate vertically. We looked up and we had a vertical seizure. He said, once we had a genius for the vertical, and now we're all horizontalists. And that explains a lot about why he had left the Jewish world. And he has this idea that if he goes to Israel, something will happen there, that he can be born again, that he'll be able to sing again, that something wild might happen to him if he leaves the island and joins this war in some form. And the amazing thing is, if he's looking for a vertical seizure, where does he end up finding it? In Sinai. And if he was aware of that irony, he doesn't mention it in his writing about the war, but it's one of the incredible ironies of this story. He's looking for a vertical seizure, an echo of something that happened at Sinai, and he ends up back in Sinai. The whole story happens, a few dozen miles away from Mount Sinai. And something happens. It's unclear exactly what. He's too cagey a character. He's too smart to ever come out and say, I was reborn in the war, and that's why I went back on stage. But that's what happens. A few months after the war, he releases an incredible album called New Skin for the Old Ceremony, which is a reference to circumcision and birth or rebirth. And Cohen's back in the saddle. And that album includes Chelsea Hotel, which is not a bad song, and then Who by Fire, which is inspired by the Yom Kippur liturgy, Lover, 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 which was written at an Israeli Air Force base, and a number of other famous Cohen songs. And then he goes on to have this incredible career, which lasts until he's 80 years old. So something happened in the war. He finds the vertical seizure. It seems almost a ludicrous thing to expect to happen, to be reborn by traveling somewhere else. And yet, that seems to have happened.
Tal, if you wouldn't mind queuing up the second and last video clip, which is a 30-second clip from an interview that Cohen did with Israeli TV, and I think relates to Matti's point about, let's say, Jewish verticality.
Is that right?
My songs are always Jewish. They can't be anything else but Jewish.
More Jewish, I guess.
What is more Jewish, like saying somebody's a little bit pregnant or a little bit dead? I write out of my own tradition. That's my heart was circumcised in the Jewish tradition.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you. There was a secret call.
Thank you. So here we have the two metaphors that you've already mentioned. We have the vertical seizure at Sinai. We have the circumcision, the Brit Milah. I wanted to ask why, in your view, in the years that followed, he hardly ever spoke of this experience, as revelatory as it was.
One of the weirdest things about the story is how seldom it's mentioned. And in fact, even very serious Leonard Cohen fans outside Israel aren't really aware of this experience, which he almost never discusses. When he comes back, he gives an interview to a British music magazine called Zigzag, which is actually a really interesting interview. It's basically the only time that he spells out his feelings about the war. And then he goes quiet about it. And I think that again, we're guessing here. I feel a bit bad putting words into Leonard Cohen's mouth, but with that caveat, I think that the experience was very complicated for him. He doesn't leave Israel waving the Israeli flag and singing the national anthem. He's been jarred by what he saw, and I think maybe jarred by his own response to it. Initially, he goes in, again, feeling very much a part of the tribe, and he goes by a Hebrew name, and he's with the soldiers in Sinai. And then there's a moment where that shifts, and you can see it in this manuscript. Part of my book is based on this Leonard Cohen manuscript that was never published, which turned out to be gathering dust in a box in Hamilton, Ontario, and parts of it are published for the first time in my book. And in that manuscript, we get a glimpse into an unfiltered, into Leonard Cohen's unfiltered brain. And in that manuscript, he mentions a moment that seems like a turning point for him in the war. So he's in the war, he's already gone deep, and he's at an Air Force base. A helicopter lands, they're unloading wounded soldiers, which we know is something that the musicians did because there weren't always enough people to unload the wounded, and musicians would just put down their guitars and help the orderlies get the guys to the field hospital. So these soldiers are being unloaded, and he sees these dead and dying soldiers, and he's deeply disturbed by it, and he must have been visibly upset. And someone comes up to him and says, Leonard, or Elias, don't worry, these are Egyptians. And he's relieved. And then he catches himself, and he writes in the manuscript, I hate this relief. This is blood on your hands. The fact that he, even for a moment, could have been relieved that these men weren't on his side, that it was okay because these were Egyptians and not Israelis, that flew against everything that Leonard Cohen believed as a universal poet. And I think that at that moment, he begins stepping back from his very emotional tribal or familial involvement in the war. And afterwards, he plays it down. He never denies that he was here. But by 1976, when he plays the song Lover, 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 which he wrote in the war at an Israeli Air Force base, he's introducing it as a song he wrote for the Egyptians and for the Israelis in that order. So even the content that comes out of the Yom Kippur War becomes universalized by Cohen after the war. And if you are looking for hints as to the importance of the war, you really have to look very close. They're there, but you have to look very closely. You have to look at a song like Night Comes On, which comes out in the 80s, where he lists, it's like a list of intimate autobiographical episodes in his life, the birth of his children, the death of his mother. And in that song, he mentions the war. There's a verse about this war. So it's clear that it's big for him, but he leaves us guessing, and you have to peer closely into his work and into his biography to understand that the Yom Kippur War is a pivotal moment for Cohen. It's not a minor detail in his life story.
Before we broaden out, I want to ask you to do exactly that, to look very closely, to peer very closely at 8 lines of an early version of Lover, Lover, Lover that you quote. Somehow, miraculously, you rescued them from one of Cohen's notebooks, I believe. They've never been published. If you'll allow me to read them, I want to ask you to comment on how and whether they speak to that kind of ambivalence that you just noted. The lines are these. I went down to the desert to help my brothers fight. I knew that they weren't wrong, and I knew that they were not right. But bones must stand up straight and walk, and blood must move around, and men go making ugly lines across the holy ground. What are we to make of these lines?
When I set out to figure out this story, I started by tracking down soldiers who'd seen Cohen in the desert. And one of them, a soldier named Shlomi Kohuner, told me that he'd met Cohen in the desert on the far side of the Suez Canal one night in the war, and that Cohen was singing Lover, 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 which is a song that no one knew at the time because he'd just written it at an Air Force base. And he said, Shlomi, he'll never forget that Cohen called the soldiers his brothers. And this touched them deeply. They wanted to know that this international star was on our side, that he wasn't coming as a UN observer or something, that he was here with us. And he said that in the most explicit terms. Shlomi remembered. He said that we're his brothers. And the problem is that there's no such verse in Lover, Lover, Lover. At no point in Lover, Lover, Lover does Leonard Cohen call Israeli soldiers his brothers. In fact, it's completely unclear that the song was written in the Yom Kippur War. And Shlomi said that when he heard the song come out on the radio after the war, after it came out on this album, he kept waiting for that verse. Excuse me. And he waited for that verse, and then he realized that Leonard Cohen had erased the verse as part, I think, of his distancing of himself from the Israeli side in this war, as an attempt to, make sure that he was bigger than one side in this war, and in fact bigger than this war. But you really see Cohen struggling with his, Jewish affiliations in this song. So he wrote this verse, which talks about his brothers. I went down to the desert to help my brothers fight. And that doesn't leave a lot of room for ambiguity in Cohen's position. And that's what he wrote in the notebook, which I had the privilege of reading in Los Angeles at the Leonard Cohen Family Trust. And if you look at the verse, you'll see that he's actually crossed out the line. The line that says, I went down to the desert to help my brothers fight has been altered in the notebook. And instead of help my brothers fight, he's written, I went down to the desert to watch the children fight. So he's no longer helping, and it's not his brothers. Now he's kind of standing by the sandbox watching the children fight, and ultimately he completely erases the verse. So there's a whole story, there's a whole Jewish story in that verse about, whether our Judaism is in belonging to the tribe or whether our Judaism is actually belonging to no tribe, and trying to see things, universally, see them from both sides, and make sure that you're not happy that the wounded soldiers you're seeing are Egyptians and not Israelis. And this is all obviously a very complicated experience for Cohen, and it made it a very potent experience, a very powerful experience for him. But it's one of the reasons I think that he wasn't eager to talk about it, not only with the press, but also with people who are close to him who don't remember him ever mentioning this war to them.
To stay for one more moment on that one song that he composed here, Lever, 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 you do quote a stanza that did remain in the song, which does maintain the so-called friend-enemy distinction. And that is the lines, and may the spirit of this song, may it rise up pure and free, may it be a shield for you, a shield against the enemy. Why do you think those lines, to me, those lines are quite clear, and they leave behind some of the ambivalence. The moment you're invoking an enemy, you seem to be standing on one side. Where do those lines bring you?
Right. I mean, Cohen had this idea that there's another song that he writes called "There's a War." There's a war between the woman and the man. He thought relationships were kind of like war, and he thought human connections were warlike, and he used battle metaphors to describe relationships. And so you could interpret that verse, if you don't know where Lover Lover was written and for whom, you could interpret that verse as being, shield against the enemy. The enemy could be, the person you love or hate or your neighbor. But I think what's going on in that verse is something deeper in Cohen's biography. And again, I'm taking some license here to interpret Cohen, because he doesn't tell us. But one of the most important things to know about Leonard Cohen is that he's a Cohen. Right? He's a member of the priestly class in Judaism, which is called the Kohanim, and these are people who are descended from the caste of priests in the temple, and they're sometimes called Cohen. Sometimes they have that family name, and that was true of Leonard Cohen. And the role of the Cohen in Judaism in our times is not to sacrifice bulls or anything like that. The main role you have as a Kohen is to stand in front of the congregation and call down divine protection with a blessing that's called the priestly blessing, Birkat HaKohanim. And it's a really short blessing. It's 15 words, Yevarechecha Hashem v'yishmerecha, and so forth. May God bless and protect you. And Cohen, I discovered when reading this manuscript, was very much aware that he was a Kohen and that he wasn't doing his job. It was really surprising to me to find that out, because I knew he wrestled with his Judaism. I had no idea that he cared that he was a Kohen. And yet here he was, clearly aware that he wasn't doing his job for the community, which was to protect them, to make sure that divine protection was being, called down from on high and brought into the synagogue, brought down to the level of mortals. And so he's standing in a theater at an Air Force base, the first concert he does in the war, as a matter of fact. And he's facing these pilots who are being sent off to die. I mean, it's clear to everyone that some of the people who are at this concert are not going to survive the week. And he wants to protect them. He wants to do something that protects them. And he's obviously not he's not in Cohen mode, so he's not going to stand up and recite the priestly blessing. I think he doesn't think he has the standing to do that. But instead, he writes a verse that sounds a lot like the priestly blessing if you accept some creative change, right? There's not that much distance between may God bless and protect you and may this song be a shield for you. It kind of sounds the same. And I think that what Cohen is doing in that verse is being a Cohen in his own way. He's struggling to be something that he knows he's supposed to be for these people. And so I think it's actually a very powerful moment, and I actually get shivers every time I hear that line. Because if you can imagine the scene where the line was written, it was written between two concerts at an Air Force base called Chatzor in the middle of the Yom Kippur War. The lines are very resonant, and I think it also shows us that the song "Lover, Lover, Lover" is not a love song; it's a war song.
I think that, this, what appears to be a love song can be a war song. What appears to be conflict song, war song can itself be a love song. You have a marvelous line in the book where you describe Cohen's relationship to Israel as being tenuous, like being in love with someone you don't really know. And that brought me back to this clip of the 1972 fiasco where he walks off stage in Jerusalem, where he says, oh, there's also these elements within me, the male and female, that don't seem to be quite aligned. They don't seem to be at this moment quite in love. And it's precisely at the points where the love fails, where one doesn't know what one is loving, that some of these lyrics seem to emerge. And he doesn't know the country, he doesn't know the people. I think you write at the beginning, he didn't even want to come here to perform at the beginning, right? It was sort of a chance encounter at a cafe that even persuaded him to do something like this. It wasn't as if and I mentioned at the outset, he didn't bring his guitar. So all of this was done somehow without premeditation. As you said, as far as Bob Hope, super stylized, super produced USO shows as you can possibly imagine, right? He's sitting on in the shade of a tank drinking cognac with Arik Sharon one day, doesn't even know where he is in some of these cases, right? And yet he wants these songs to be a shield. Therefore, as I read it, an expression of love for some brothers that he doesn't even know.
Yes, I think that's very well put. There's a lot going on in his head in those weeks. It's not just a regular concert tour, and he's not doing it for the money. There's no there's no money involved, and there's also no PR involved. No one knows he's here. So he's obviously not, this is not a professional move by Cohen. This is something that's coming from deep in his soul. And when he comes to Israel, as you mentioned, he's not even planning to play. He tells people who he meets initially that he wants to volunteer on a kibbutz, pick grapefruit, according to one woman who I met. And he ends up at the front by chance because he's in a cafe in Tel Aviv, and he gets recognized by a few Israeli musicians who are quite famous, but he doesn't know who they are. One of them is Oshik Levy, another is Ilana Hovina, who was a famous actress of the time and singer. And eventually they're joined by Matti Kaspi and by Pupi Kalonon. And it's that group that convinces him to come to the war, but that's not what he intended to do. So what led him here was something much more internal and was much more of a tribal response, that he just needed to be here. Something bad was happening to the Jewish people, and he just needed to be with them.
I'd like to, in our few minutes remaining, ask you to broaden the angle a little bit from Cohen and Yom Kippur War to something a little bit broader. You are the most discerning writer I know on the subject of music and culture, especially culture of the Middle East. You've done that in many, many pieces. I think you have a piece in the Jewish Review of Books now on that subject. And it shows up in an extraordinary way, although you never sort of conceptualize it, of course, but in an extraordinary way in this book, Who by Fire. Can you say something about sort of how writers and journalists can be sometimes tone deaf to this place, and that tone deafness is reflected in a misunderstanding of the musical scene? I don't want to put it absurdly generally. But do you think along those lines?
I think you can learn a lot about a place from its music. And we have a tendency as journalists to think that certain things matter, like GDP and what politicians say, and what's on pop radio doesn't matter. But for most people, pop radio matters more. What people are, the tunes that are playing in your head and the way they sound and what people are saying. And one undeniable audio impression of Israel is that the country is very Middle Eastern, right? The dominant form of pop music in Israel is a form of pop music called mizrahi, which means literally Eastern, and it's a Middle Eastern kind of music. It has Greek influences and Western influences, but it sounds discordant to Western ears if you're not used to it. And that is what the kids listen to here for the most part. The biggest artists here are Mizrahi artists. And if you realize that that's true, then you are forced to admit that what we're dealing with here is a Middle Eastern country. And that, I think, is maybe the most important thing.
So earlier you described that, sorry to interrupt, but you described that marvelous photograph as a photograph of almost historic proportions, because among other things, it's a meeting of the diaspora and the Israeli, right? So is that part of the, let's say, discordance today that we see between the diaspora and this country? Can that be somehow described musically?
Yeah, that thought hadn't occurred to me, but it's a great thought, and the idea of a kind of discordance in the music, because of course that represents how different the places are. And it's very hard, I think, for a Jew from the United States to hear, Omer Adam or one of the other Mizrahi artists here and be into it, and it might work the other way around as well. So yes, I think music is a real window into the soul, and the songs that people like. So they say something deep about us. It's not just, froth on the surface to be disregarded. Culture is really important. And Orwell was great about that. He has a fantastic essay about dirty postcards, which he takes to be a real indicator of culture. And he takes them seriously. He doesn't laugh at them at all, even though it's low art, but he thinks it's very important and worth analysis. And so do I. And in the story of the Yom Kippur War, we really see a musical story that has a lot to say about what's going on. I mean, when Cohen lands in Israel, the music of the country is still very much that old Israeli music with the accordion, and it's the kibbutz, and it's very on-message, Zionist, music about making the desert bloom and winning battles, and very collective. A lot of music that's written in the collective, in a lot of the use of the word we. And that changes in the Yom Kippur War. There's a change in the sound of the country in the Yom Kippur War, because the faith in the leadership is shattered, because the founding generation is discredited, because Israel loses its innocence in many ways. And the use of the word we really goes out of fashion, and the accordion dies. Someone smart once told me that one of the fatalities of the Yom Kippur War was the accordion. You wouldn't hear it for another 30 or 40 years until it reappears ironically in pop music. But the accordion is killed, and that old style of music is killed in the Yom Kippur War. And instead, we get a kind of music that sounds a lot like Leonard Cohen. So it's more individual, it's more concerned with the spirit, it's more open to God, it's more introspective, and it's written in the first person singular, it's I. So it's not just a discordance, there's an interaction there. We're listening to what's going on. Their messengers like Leonard Cohen are bringing Greenwich Village to the Sinai front, and there's movement back and forth. But there's definitely a whole story to be told about Jewish life in the last 100 years through the story of music, certainly. And this might be one of the great ones. At least I think it is. I think it's one of the great Jewish moments. This very strange, unimportant moment in the Yom Kippur War. I think it's a really kind of powerful cultural moment. And I also happen to think that it's one of the greatest moments in the history of rock and roll.
That's a great note on which to end. One of the greatest moments in the history of rock and roll. I'd like to thank you, Matti. I would like to